Then the next thing that came, which also opened it out, was that one of the rooms below, we got a wonderful weaver from the weaver service center, and he was a Himachali, and he set up a pit loom, and then we also got a stand-up loom. So the pit loom was, where you got almost 3.5 feet width and thing, and we made duddies on that. And on the small loom, we made some beautiful shawls where he brought this terrific wool and we dyed it there. So this excited everybody. He was there, he would teach them, he would help them, and people would make designs. So that informal craft aspect, added to the larger, what shall I say, moving from art to craft to, but not in any directional way that yes, we've got to have it. But as you said, that bit by bit, the first stirring towards any formulation was after discussing Dr. Faustus and Pupin, kind of leading that it bit by bit emerged that it's proposing, the place for people, actual title emerged later, but narrative painting, figurative stories, all that. I had gone to Ahmedabad and I met, I think, Krishna Kumar, Alex, one or two others, and I felt that there was a different kind of sculpture. Pushpa was already in Baroda, and there was, I think, Rimzan was there, I forgot. But with the core of these 3-4 people, I felt that there's a different kind of sculpture, different kind of attitude to figuration. So it would be worth exploring a thematic, a medium specific workshop. So that was the first and about the only one that did, and I was very pleased that it yielded then an exhibition and in fact introduced a movement which Gayatri Sinha says as important is place for people, but because it's sculpture, it doesn't get that kind of thing. When I came across these sculptors in Ahmedabad and proposed the seven young sculptors, I think that was the next articulation of a position where again basically moving away from a Henry Moore aesthetic of a piece of marble on a pedestal, that the image, the material, the flexibility from terracotta to wood to fiberglass, was represented or by the different artists. I don't have to say who they are. So it became in tandem with place for people. And as I said, Gayatri Sinha says that why was place for people given more importance than the seven young sculptors, because they did change the course of making sculpture. Of course, subsequently everything became much more refined, sophisticated. As the market started, emerging, and the demands both of an Indian market as well as then a Western market. I think Ranjit Hoskote said from the year 2000, the millennium, it produces a new generation, a new hosting of people. In fact, it's very interesting. The number of workshops, artist workshops, grew so much all over the world that artists were invited for residencies. So Kasoli was nothing great that, if they were going to Italy or France or wherever it is for an international artist workshop, they obviously got much more out of it because of the international group. That relationship between posing people and taking the photograph, I used the photograph as a support. I didn't have the facility of Nalini Malani or the naive confidence of Bhupen Khakar, who didn't need any photograph. He would just make them. I was awkward as a figure, even when that collective mural that we did in Shah House, Viren Shah, Rajiv Sethi was helping him. So Rajiv said, "Will you do a mural, in Viren Shah's house?" So I said, "I met Viren Shah, but I'm not going to do a mural in his house. I want to do a collective mural." So he said, "You artists will do a collective mural." I said, "Let me try." So I got two very good friends, and we all and then when we went there and we decided we won't make a mural on the wall, but do a reverse painting one, and it allowed a lot of freedom. So both Bhupen and Nalini did some very fine the watercolor drawing, and then I used, because the 6 foot high sheets of glass like that, so I did my spill drip method. So I would just drop the watercolor or spill it, and then it would move in these patterns. So the very fluid nature of the background, was contributed by me, and then I got somebody to pose in a very stiff way as if he is the spectator looking at this work. So that's how it grew in a very interesting manner. But this relationship to other artists gradually started happening, and in my case, the one of the very early works that I did, which was in collaboration combined, was a portrait of Krishna Kumar, where in three panels of wood, I kind of put one of them on the ground and the other on the wall. So it splits it, and in fact his head is in the straight panel, and in the sloping one is his body. So that disjuncture, already for the first time in so-called pictorial work, became sculpture because of that. And the splitting, I mean, metaphorically cut his head on the other side. So that was the first time that the object itself and its form had a relationship to the thematic of it. And then the others were, yeah, the local scenes which I photographed and did large paintings. That time labor was still going and cutting these pine trees, and then they would, tighten their backs, and they used to go below my house, and so I watched them. Once I photographed them, and the man who was carrying this amount of grass. So I said, "Iska wazan kitna hai?" So he said, "Quintal. Quintal is 100 kilos." So that's, it's quite a weight. So I said, "Will you just stand here?" I did some drawings, and so in that case, I did drawings and then made the painting. So these are two works of pre-industrial labor, which is going below your house, and then you connect with whatever sense of connection to the labor and representing that person.
That exhibition was very special because we were all doing our own work, but we met to discuss how to formulate each one's uh, like statement and how to formulate a joint statement for this exhibition, which took place in Bhopal. So we used to meet in Baroda. I think we met a couple of times and worked this out. And whenever writing was concerned, I remember we used to kind of try and uh, run to Geeta and say, "Help us out with this." And she absolutely, like, sternly would turn us away and say, "No, that is your thing. You three must work it out between yourselves. I'm not going to help you with any of that." So that way we kind of, and our kind of love for Kitai and his writing at that time, Nalini writing her piece, I writing my piece, all together in that shed in Baroda. So that kind of collaboration. And of course, Nalini and Vivan and Bhupen took that another level in collaborating on works and lots of, and then there were all kinds of multimedia collaborations and things like that, which I was not part of. But I think this element was very important for them. That's what one hears, that the younger generation of artists, in fact, expressing that what you people enjoyed and the way in which you related to each other has become increasingly difficult, and we don't have that. So that's a great pity. I think to what extent it is because of the kind of commercial pressures, to what extent it is because of just the pace at which people are living and the pace at which people are producing works. I think generally uh, earlier it was very much up to the artist's inclination of whether he made like two works in a month or whether he made 20 works in a month. It was basically his inclination that dictated that, which later I think could no longer sustain. And more and more people were dependent on. Another thing was that most of uh, the earlier generations, unless you had your own means of income, you worked. So you had jobs somewhere or the other, and you taught or whatever, and then you painted on your kind of spare time. That also changed because of the kind of pressure of the commercial listings. So there was a demand, all kinds of demands increased. It might bring out the best in artists too, and I think there are artists who responded like wonderfully with an increased pace of work, with increased intellectual focus, and putting aside everything else, and seeing that career as absolutely the most important thing, which can help. But obviously, it also loses out on certain human kind of elements. Uh, the losses, the how the artist makes up for that loss in his work is what is important ultimately. It was an like interesting insight that I kind of got at some stage, where uh, like earlier one saw uh, one's influences. There were lots of influences on one's work from the West, from European modernism, and one saw that as relating to those uh, as as an individual, that you were influenced by like whoever, Leges, Picasso, César, whatever. Uh, at a certain point, I kind of realized, and when I became more familiar with the Indian art scene as such, and what had been done earlier on the Indian art scene, and this question of Indianness and Western influence and Indianness handled at various levels by two generations earlier to us, one became aware that one has inherited actually a certain tradition already of modernism. That one is now working within a tradition that has been built up from the 40s or even earlier, once one became more conscious of the Bengal school and contribution of Vinod Bihari and things like that. So there was this tradition that was there, which mediated any relationship with the West, with Europe or with European modernism. So it was not like a direct influence, but it was already something that had been digested, that had been sorted out, that had been, paths had been kind of chalked, chalked out or worked out in that. And then you were, in fact, inheriting that and then following that up. So that was something of an important kind of sense. And therefore, when we actually met the Germans, both in Germany and here, it worked at both levels. Like at one level, as I said earlier, that it was the first time, for example, that one was confronting, uh, for example, the whole thinkers of Frankfurt School. Like I don't know what, Arvid, for example, was very well read. So, or even like Thomas Mann or music, and so all these things were something that were discussed in Kasauli, and you know classical music, Schoenberg's 12 scale. All this was very, I mean, one didn't understand much, but it was discussed at a direct level. So at one level, one was kind of approaching this whole European culture uh, and appropriating it at a more direct level rather than having just an intellectual understanding of it. Here it felt real. It felt as if, you know, that you were touching it someplace. And then there was this element of distancing from it through the idea that you already belong to a certain kind of evolution of contemporary art, of modern art. And that had placed itself at a certain distance from the West already, and that you were in fact now your direct like answer, let us say, was was not to the West, but it was to what had just followed before you were in India. That was very much part of my like understanding of what my role was. You know that it was to take art, my not only my art, but the whole understanding of art to a larger public. And the reason was that lack of exposure was the main thing that I could see. I could see that in many other fields, like in literature, in poetry, uh, the Marathi readership or generally people were aware of modernism in a very deep sense. But in visual arts, somehow, because there was this gap between what they have seen and what they're exposed to and their understanding. So that was at one level a need that to actually be able to take this. So I mean, at that time, it was only possible to take exhibitions of reproductions and things like that, and go and have slideshows and things like that. So that was very much part of the way in which I saw myself, my work as an artist. So apart from what I did paint, from my subject matter and the kind of attitude to that, there was this element which was never separate from that. And that got a certain approval within the Kasauli thing. So that was another kind of thing that boosted my need for doing that. That definitely was there. I mean, for me, it came mostly connected to Akbar and Tayyab's view about narrative and about storytelling. And obviously, they felt that battles that have already been won against storytelling through modern modernity, I mean modernism. Now this generation of people are going back on that, and you know, instead of taking it ahead, they're somewhere going back. So one took that criticism on board. Essentially, one had so much respect essentially for the elder generation that one understood their position from their point of view. And in fact, Focus is an excellent example of the exhibition Focus that Geeta Kapoor curated for Kemold. Is an excellent example of how the difference between these two generations were playing out, you know, between the elder generation. And I think she also mentions that the younger generation had this great amount of respect for the older generation, but the need was clear, you know, of how your connection with reality and your immediate reality was to kind of work out in your work. So that classic this distinction, as like earlier artists were speaking of man with a capital M, and now it is that particular vegetable seller or that particular worker and not someone, you know. So that difference was there.
Intervening, I mean, visually intervening brings into my mind some thin end of the wedge sort of thing. I don't like that. I think it was a kind of, these days it's a word that I use a lot, so let me chuck it in. I don't know whether it, I mean, it was like this, it was horizontal. I think it just linked. So, rhizomatic in that sense, you know. So, it had, the planes were there. or were made in which different kinds of things could happen, and they had similarities and dissimilarities in huge arguments, but they were all linked in particular non-hierarchical ways. So it was a kind of non-hierarchy of expression, in my opinion. I think that was something that maybe, at least as theatre people, whether you talk to Anamika or Gitanjali, I think we all remember, because it just seems to be possible then to have a non-hierarchy of means. I think that's something. And I think whether that is the intervention or that is the production, I don't know. But I think that it was, in my mind, a play.
There was a fair bit of art making that may have emerged, in fact, in the context of Kasoli. And so this happened primarily in the visual arts, and I imagine to a fair extent in theatre. So the place for people, post place for people, the different moves that take place, for example, in the visual arts. Kasoli, I imagine, would have had something to do with those. Um, so there might have been some emphasis on production, but you're right. I mean, the move, the distinction between production and intervention may also be a distinction between something that's actually made and shown versus being part of, marginal to, engaged in producing a kind of parallel track to, or even opposing certain established canonical structures. I mean, definitely that form of engagement with the canon, and maybe intervening into it to reverse it, to take it aside, was pretty pivotal, I think, to something like Kasoli. I mean, were it to have gone on, we would have found a large number of auteurs, masters of cinema or music, or whatever, of visual arts, which we would have been able to revisit as we went along. I mean, I know the visual arts, certainly I know that the Hussains and the progressives, and the way that we really rethought those was quite central. I'm not sure that something similar happened in the cinema there, but it has happened subsequently. I mean, someone like Mrinal Sen, for example, has been reimagined rather differently from the time. The need for an aesthetic practice as being at the vanguard of some kind of truly new political alternative had been, in the early 80s, a very, very pivotal development in that particular context. Um, Additionally, I mean, the main thing about this idea of a common set of problems was also enabled by the fact that there were a common set of artist references and a common set of textual references that we could all assume. I mean, we would have all read or Adorno. We would have all known something about Rona Barth. We would be familiar with the British, I mean, in my case at least, certainly the film historian, people like Peter Wallen and so on. But we would have known our John Berger, we would have known our Clement Greenberg, in a sense. So there was, I think, a certain vocabulary that was also possible at that point of time. Now, neither of them obtains today. I mean, today, I am very unlikely to even know, if you say, for example, oh, I saw this very interesting film. Chances are I never have heard of it, or vice versa. So that we all almost have our own individual canons. I mean, we just don't seem to have a shared vocabulary, unless, of course, something else is happening in the context of digital, digital sort of, social media type sharing, which I would not know that much about. So yeah, so that situation may not obtain today. Canon question is quite serious, and the problem that I've always had is with the assumption that recognizing that canons are problematic does not automatically lead to its decanonization alternative. That you need canons if for no reason other than to argue against them. So you can produce a canon and then argue against it. This is possible. Having said that, I am not sure that we were not against cannons, huh? That we're not for cannons. I mean, I think that we had produced a kind of counter cannon at that point of time. As I was saying, that I think in theatre, to some extent, in music, in film, at least in those, and visual arts, I think that there were certain kinds of canonical languages which we all did share, and we shared them, I think, across those disciplines, which was, I think, quite an interesting situation. I mean, so for example, something like, even in music, I mean, say the khayal. There's this essay that Neela Bhagwat has written, the khayal, what it is and what it is not, and the emphasis on the bandish, and the Gwalior Gharana as against the decorativeness of, for example, the Jaipur Gharana, and so on, were things that via cinema had been part of a certain kind of commonsensical situation at Kasoli. And there would have been, I think, a kind of a recognition that there were these possibilities. I mean, they say that Nasreen Mohammadi used to enjoy listening to Bhimsen Joshi while she painted. Now, this speaks a lot to that moment. This kind of connection is something that really does work. That M.F. Hussain used to quote Urdu shairis, for instance, and so the thing about literature coming together. I think that some of that was in that interdisciplinarity, and I think that it had a counter canon, you might say, at that point of time.